Welcome to the deep dive.
Oh,
Today we're going way back, like to 19th century Europe, and it's a time just like overflowing with new ideas and, these movements that like really shape the world around us today. And we're talking about like right after the Enlightenment and how all those powerful ideas about, freedom and reason and stuff really shook things up.
it is fascinating how that all happened, isn't it? I mean, we always think of history as this like straight line,
Right.
but this period is more like a crossroads, you know?
Yeah.
You've got like the French Revolution and Napoleon still like casting this huge shadow. And then on top of that, you have this wave of, totally new ideologies like liberalism and socialism and nationalism all kind of like competing for attention.
Right. And like our sources really get into how all of that went down, especially after Napoleon's defeat in 1815.
Mm.
We got the Congress of Vienna trying to like put everything back together, but also all these new movements like pushing for change at the same time. It's like everyone's trying to figure out, okay, what happens now?
Yeah. Exactly. And the Congress of Vienna is like really key here. Like, think of it as Europe hitting the reset button. All the big powers get together and they're basically saying, look, we just went through like decades of war and revolution. Let's try to like create some balance of power, make sure no one country gets too powerful, and hopefully avoid another Napoleon situation.
So it's all about like going back to the old ways, right?
Yeah.
Kind of like trying to pretend the French Revolution never happened.
Well, not exactly. That's where it gets interesting. You see, the Congress of Vienna, they wanted to go back to the old order, but the Enlightenment had already planted these seeds of change, and you can't just like ignore them. You can't just like erase all those ideas about individual liberty and reason, They're out there, and people are starting to demand a say in like how they're governed.
And that's where liberalism comes in, right? This whole idea about individual rights, limited government, free markets. It feels so familiar, so like modern even.
Absolutely. Liberalism was totally a product of the Enlightenment, and it really challenged the old systems of like monarchy and privilege. It was about empowering the individual, giving them more freedom and control over their lives, and over their government too.
So this is where we start seeing ideas about like free speech and representative government right. Like, hey, we don't want a king just telling us what to do. We want a voice.
Yeah, you got it. And we see this play out in a lot of ways. For example, our sources talk about like Belgium breaking away from the Netherlands in 1830. This was fueled by people wanting self-rule, like a classic liberal idea. And then closer to home, you have Johann Rudolf Thorbecke, who like wrote the Dutch Constitution in 1848. That thing really limited the king's power and gave citizens more of a voice, which was a big win for liberals.
Wow. So these weren't just ideas. They were like actually shaping political events. But I imagine not everyone was so thrilled about this whole liberalism thing.
Oh, definitely not. Like, change is rarely easy, especially if it threatens the people in power. And as liberalism gained momentum, you see another ideology popping up: socialism.
Okay, so socialism, that's all about equality, right?
Yeah.
Like making sure everyone gets a fair shot, especially with all this huge industrialization going on.
Exactly. Socialism came about as a response to all the inequality and social problems that came with industrialization. Think about it. Like, cities are exploding with people looking for work, living in horrible conditions. Work was dangerous, long hours, terrible pay. Poverty and inequality were everywhere. Socialism was basically saying, hey, this isn't right. We need to fix this, and the government needs to step in and make sure things are fair.
So it's kind of the opposite of liberalism, right? Like liberalism is about individual freedom, while socialism is more about like the well-being of everyone and the role of the state in making that happen. There are two different answers to the question, what kind of society do we want?
That's a great way to put it. And even within socialism, there were different ideas. You had these radical groups like communists and anarchists who thought that the entire capitalist system had to be overthrown, like completely, sometimes even through, violent revolution.
I can see how with all that rapid change, some people would just want to like hit the reset button on the whole system. But I'm guessing there were also like less extreme socialists, right?
Yeah, of course. You also had the Social Democrats who wanted to work within the existing system to bring about gradual change through like democratic means like elections and stuff, things like social welfare programs and labor reforms. These debates about what role the government should play, they're still happening today, aren't they?
For sure. And it's interesting to see how those arguments were taking shape back then. We've been talking a lot about politics and economics, but what about other parts of life? Did the Enlightenment have any impact on things like gender roles?
That's an important question, and it shows how complicated this period really was. The Enlightenment did inspire movements for social change, but its impact on gender roles was, well, kind of mixed. Feminism, which is all about, Women's rights and equality with men really struggled in the 19th century.
Yeah, I can imagine. Back then, a woman's place was seen as being at home,
Mm.
right? Raising kids, and definitely not out there demanding equal rights.
You're right. The 19th century was all about this thing historians call the bourgeois family ideal. It basically said that women belonged in the home, and that really limited their chances to get an education, get jobs, or participate in politics. So while feminism had its roots in the Enlightenment, it faced a lot of pushback during this time.
So it sounds like progress was slow and probably really frustrating for those early feminists. But I'm guessing they didn't just give up.
Oh, no, not at all. They were pioneers, Like they were challenging the way things were and making a path for the women who came after them. There were amazing people like Aletta Jacobs. She was the first woman to study at a Dutch university. Can you imagine how much courage that took to break down those barriers?
It's amazing to think about her walking onto that campus and probably everyone is staring at her.
Yeah.
It really shows the challenges those early feminists had to overcome. But it also shows how determined they were to change things.
Exactly. And as the century went on, women's movements started to gain momentum. They focused on issues like voting rights, education, and fighting against problems like prostitution and alcoholism. These were big, complicated problems, and women were the ones on the front lines trying to solve them.
So it's like all these different threads of change are all coming together, like in politics, economics, and in society. It must have been such a dynamic and kind of crazy time to live through.
It really was. And as if liberalism, socialism, and feminism weren't enough to shake things up, there was another powerful force at play: nationalism.
Ah, yes. Nationalism. That feeling of shared identity based on things like language, culture, or a shared history.
Hmm.
And that often leads to people wanting to rule themselves right, like we want to be in
You
charge.
got it. And nationalism had this weird two-sided nature. Like it could bring people together under this shared identity, but it could also tear people apart, especially in empires like Austria-Hungary, where all these different groups were fighting for their independence.
So on the one hand, you have places like Italy and Germany unifying in the mid-1800s, and that was driven by nationalism. But then on the other hand, you have all these conflicts inside these big empires where people felt like they were being ignored or mistreated.
Exactly. Nationalism was like this double-edged sword. It could inspire people to do great things, but it could also lead to conflict and division. And even today, we're still dealing with the consequences of nationalism, aren't we?
Oh, definitely. It seems like just when we think we've figured out nationalism, it pops up in some new way.
It's a force that never really goes away. It just changes and adapts. But one thing's for sure, it totally changed the 19th century, redrawing the map of Europe and setting the stage for conflicts that would happen in the 20th century.
So we've got all these big new ideas: liberalism, socialism, feminism, nationalism, and they're all challenging the way things used to be. But I'm guessing not everyone was happy about all this change.
You're right. In fact, there was this growing backlash against all these new ideas. A lot of people felt like things were changing too fast and becoming too radical, and that's where we see conservatism starting to become a real political force.
So if I'm understanding this right, conservatives were basically saying, hold on a sec, let's slow down with all this revolution and chaos.
Exactly. They were really suspicious of the Enlightenment and all the ideas that came from it. They wanted to hold on to traditional values and institutions, things like the monarchy, the aristocracy, the church. They saw liberalism and socialism and all those other isms as a threat to the way things were, like a threat to social stability.
So conservatism was kind of a reaction to all that change, a way of holding on to what was familiar in a world that was suddenly feeling very different.
That's a great way to think about it. It was about sticking to the old ways, sticking to a sense of order and hierarchy that was being threatened by these new ideas that were more about equality and individual freedom.
And it's interesting to see this back and forth between tradition and change playing out in the 19th century, almost like this tug of war, each side pulling in a different direction.
You nailed it. It was a time of huge ideological struggle, and the outcome of that struggle would go on to have a massive impact on the 20th century and even beyond. But we'll have to dive into all that in our next segment.
Sounds good to me. I'm already hooked, and I can't wait to see how this all unfolds. So we were talking about this like big clash between old ways of thinking and new ideas and how conservatism was like pushing back against all this change sweeping through Europe. But, ideas are one thing, but how did all this like actually affect people's lives back then?
That's the important question, right? And one of the biggest things that changed everything was obviously the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't just about like new machines and factories popping up everywhere. It was like this total transformation of how society worked. People were moving from the countryside into cities looking for work in these like booming industrial centers. Our sources really highlight how this led to a bunch of new problems, what they called the social question.
The social question, huh? What does that even mean?
Well, think about it. Cities are suddenly packed with people desperate for jobs, often living in like really awful conditions, cramped and dirty. And the work itself was often dangerous, with crazy long hours and like super low pay. Poverty and inequality were just everywhere. The social question was basically society trying to figure out how to deal with all these downsides of industrialization.
So it's not just philosophers talking about ideas anymore. It's like real problems affecting millions of people.
You got it. And this is where those different ideologies we were talking about before, like liberalism and socialism, they come in with different solutions. Liberals, they were all about free markets and letting people figure things out on their own. They thought that if the economy was growing, everyone would eventually benefit. They said the government shouldn't interfere too much and should mostly just focus on protecting people's rights and property.
But the socialists weren't really buying that a rising tide lifts all boats argument, were they?
No, not really. They saw capitalism as like this system that just exploits people where the rich keep getting richer and the poor stay poor. They thought the government had to step in, regulate the economy and create social programs to help the working class.
So you've got this like fundamental disagreement about what role the government should play in society. And I imagine these debates got pretty intense, especially as labor movements and trade unions were demanding better conditions for workers.
It was a time of so much social and political activism. Workers were organizing, going on strike more and more, and socialist parties were starting to gain power in parliaments. The fight for workers' rights was really heating up, and it would end up shaping politics for many years to come.
It's amazing to see how these ideas went from being theories to becoming these real political movements that were impacting people's lives. And speaking of shaping things, let's go back to nationalism. Italy and Germany uniting in the mid-1800s, that must have been a huge deal.
Oh, yeah, it completely changed the map of Europe. Imagine these places, some of them divided for centuries, all of a sudden coming together to form these brand new nation states. It really shows you the power of that national identity, of having a shared language and culture and history.
It sounds almost romantic, all these divided regions coming together under one flag.
Mm.
But I'm guessing it wasn't always so peaceful and harmonious, was it?
You're right to be a little skeptical. The reality of unification was often really messy and sometimes violent. Take Germany, for example. That whole process was basically orchestrated by this Prussian politician, Otto von Bismarck. And he wasn't afraid to use force to get what he wanted. There were wars, political schemes, and tons of backroom deals.
Wow, so it was like a real-life Game of Thrones with huge consequences and powerful people clashing. And while all this political drama was going on, what about the feminist movement? Were they making any progress in this rapidly changing world?
It's important to remember that even with all this change happening, a lot of the traditional views about women's roles in society were still really strong. That bourgeois family ideal that we talked about before, where women are expected to stay home and take care of the family, that was still a really powerful idea.
So I'm guessing that made it pretty difficult for feminists to push for the changes they wanted to see.
Oh, definitely. It was a constant uphill battle. But even with all those challenges, that first wave of feminism did make some real progress. In some countries, women finally got access to higher education, though they often faced a lot of discrimination and prejudice. And by the end of the century, the movement for women's suffrage, that's the right to vote, was starting to gain some real traction.
So even though change was slow and people resisted it, those early feminists were really paving the way for future generations to demand full equality. It's inspiring to see them fighting for change, even when it felt like they were facing so much opposition.
Their determination and courage is amazing. They knew that changing society doesn't happen overnight. It takes constant work, organization, and a willingness to challenge people's deeply held beliefs.
It's fascinating to see how all these things, industrialization, political upheaval, social movements, they were all happening at the same time in the 19th century. It's like this giant tapestry, and each thread is part of this big, complex, and always evolving picture.
That's a great analogy. And what makes this time period so interesting is that it's not just about dates and names, it's about ideas and how those ideas shape history. It's about the choices people make, the movements they join, the struggles they go through, and the things they leave behind for future generations.
And speaking of what gets left behind, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some of the big takeaways from the 19th century that you think are still relevant today?
Well, one of the most important lessons, I think, is that progress doesn't always happen in a straight line. It's usually messy and unpredictable and full of contradictions. We see this in how different ideologies rise and fall, in the clashes between tradition and change, and in this ongoing effort to balance individual freedom with social responsibility.
So it's not just about memorizing facts and dates, it's about understanding how complicated history really is and how it still affects us today.
Exactly. And as we dig deeper into the later part of the 19th century in our next segment, keep this idea in mind. History isn't just a story about the past, it's a story that's still being written, and we're all part of it.
All right, so we've been through this like crazy ride of political and social change in 19th century Europe, empires rising and falling, all these different ideologies clashing, and like regular people trying to make sense of a world that's changing super fast. What do you think is the most important thing that this era like left behind?
That's a really good question. And it's hard to just pick one thing. But if I had to, I'd say it's this ongoing struggle to make those big Enlightenment ideals work in a world that was changing so quickly. The ideas of individual freedom and equality and progress that gave people so much hope, but they also unleashed all these forces that were really hard to control. Things that led to new kinds of inequality and conflict and social upheaval.
Like opening Pandora's box, right? You get these amazing ideas about freedom and reason, but then all this other stuff comes out too, and it seems like we're still dealing with that stuff today.
Exactly. We see it in all these debates we have today about, what the government should be doing, the balance between individual rights and what we owe to each other, and the challenges of dealing with this globalized world where different cultures and ideas are constantly bumping into each other. So many of the big questions we're asking today go all the way back to the 19th century.
So it's like we're carrying this torch. They're trying to keep building on all the progress that was made, but also realizing how complicated and messy things can get when you're dealing with these really powerful ideas.
That's a great way to put it. We're part of this legacy, but we also have a responsibility to shape what happens next. And I think that's one of the most important things to remember when we're thinking about history. It's not just some old story. It's something that's still happening, and we're all a part of it.
Yeah, it's like we're having this conversation with the past, trying to figure out why people made the choices they did, what challenges they had to face, and what we can learn from all of it. Hopefully, we can use that knowledge to make better choices now.
Totally. And one of the big lessons from the 19th century is that history doesn't usually have easy answers. It's messy and complicated. It's a mix of everyone's experiences and all their different points of view. And I think that's what makes it so interesting to study.
It's like a big puzzle, right? You keep finding new pieces, and the picture just keeps getting bigger and more complicated. And sometimes you have to rearrange all the pieces to see things in a new way.
Exactly. That's the cool thing about studying history. It's all about discovery and questioning what you thought you knew and constantly learning more about the world around us.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the ideas that shaped 19th century Europe. It's been a wild journey through some of the most important events and movements in human history. I don't know about you, but I'm definitely feeling inspired to keep learning more about history.
And as you do, remember to be curious. Ask questions, challenge the stories you hear, and try to see things from different perspectives. The more we understand about the past, the better we can understand the present, and the better we can shape the future.
I love that. And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive into 19th century Europe, make sure you like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'll see you next time when we'll explore another exciting chapter in history.